My father pointed right at me in a room full of his most important colleagues and laughed. He said, "I built this entire wing for history, and my daughter, well, she just likes to play with the dusty papers in the basement." The sting of those words was nothing new. It was the familiar emptiness of being completely invisible to my own family. But how could they know? How could they possibly understand that the tattoo they hated, the ink they called meaningless, was the one thing an entire team of Navy SEALs had prayed to see? Let us know where you are listening from in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the moment they find out the truth. The smell is what I notice first always. It is the scent of old paper, of dry leather bindings, and of time itself resting in the quiet dark. Down here in the university's military archives, the silence is a physical thing. It is a cathedral, like silence broken only by the gentle hum of the climate control systems and the soft whisper of my own breathing. This is my kingdom, a fortress of silence built 3 floors beneath the manicured lawns and brick pathways of a world I never quite fit into. My name is Dr. Aris Thorne, and this basement is my sanctuary. Today, like most days, I was working on a series of maritime charts from the early 8s. The paper was brittle, the color faded to a pale sepia. It required delicate work, a surgeon's precision. I wore white cotton gloves as my fingers traced the faded coastline of a forgotten tactical route. My breathing was shallow, controlled, each movement deliberate. This was more than a job. It was a communion with ghosts, a process of listening to the echoes they left behind on parchment and ink. In this world of quiet precision, I was a master. I could coax secrets from documents that had been silent for 200 years. But upstairs, in the world of cocktail parties and donor plaques, I was just Harrison Thorne's quiet, slightly disappointing daughter. The one with the advanced degree who chose a life surrounded by dust instead of dividends. And then there was the tattoo. It sat on the inside of my right forearm, usually hidden by my lab coat sleeve. It was not a rebellious splash of color from my youth. It was an intricate wheel of ancient script, a series of symbols and coordinates inked in black. The lines were as fine as a single human hair, forming a pattern that no one, not even my own parents, had ever bothered to ask about. To them, it was just an embarrassing mark, a blemish on the family's polished image, a permanent reminder that I did not belong to their world. They saw ink. They did not see the promise it represented. They saw a strange design. They did not see the map that was encoded within it. As I leaned closer to the chart on my light table, my sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing the edge of the tattoo. For a moment, my focus broke. I was not looking at the 19th century map anymore. I was seeing a dusty airfield in a place I could never name, and I was hearing a voice I would never hear again, whispering a string of numbers, his numbers, the same ones now permanently etched into my skin. This ink was not a choice. It was a duty, a vow I made to a ghost, a promise to finish what he started. Up there, they called it a mistake. Down here, it was the most important thing I had ever done. The shrill ring of my cell phone felt like a violation in that sacred quiet. It was an ugly, modern sound, tearing through centuries of stillness. I flinched, pulling off my gloves and setting them carefully beside the delicate chart. The caller ID showed a picture of my parents smiling on a golf course. I let it ring twice more, a small, futile act of resistance, before answering. My mother's voice came through the speaker, polished and sharp like the crystal glasses she only used for important guests. She did not ask how I was. She began with a statement that sounded more like a royal decree. "Aris, darling, it's this Saturday. The dedication ceremony. You haven't forgotten, have you?" I had not forgotten. It had been looming on my calendar for months, a date I was quietly dreading. I mumbled something noncommittal. "Of course not, Mom." "Good," she said, her relief audible. "It's black tie, of course. Your father has a table front and center. It is incredibly important that we present a united front. Everyone who matters will be there." Then my father's voice joined in a low rumble on the speakerphone. He never bothered with pleasantries. "Aris," he said, his tone heavy with implication, "this event is the culmination of 2 years of fundraising. It's about the Harrison family legacy. Your attendance isn't optional." A familiar weight settled in my chest. It was the weight of their expectations, a burden I had carried my entire life. They did not see me Aris Thorne, the doctor of military history. They saw an extension of themselves, a piece of their legacy that was not quite polished enough, not quite behaving the way it was designed to. My life in the archives was, in their eyes, a quiet failure, a stubborn refusal to participate in the life they had planned for me. Part of me wanted to say no. I wanted to tell them I was in the middle of a critical project, that the ghosts in my basement needed me more than their donors did. But I knew I would go. I always did. It was easier than the arguments, the disappointed sighs, the week of follow-up calls, where my mother would detail just how much I had let them down. "I will be there," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "Wonderful, darling," my mother chirped, the negotiation now officially over. "Just be mindful of your appearance. It's going to be a very public evening." The call ended as abruptly as it began. The silence rushed back in, but it felt different now, colder, tainted by the world upstairs. I looked down at the 19th century chart on my desk, a puzzle of history waiting to be solved. Then I thought of the Gala, a puzzle of social maneuvering I had no interest in solving. One was a mission, the other an obligation, and I knew with a familiar sinking feeling which one I would have to put aside for the night. The week leading up to the Gala was a quiet countdown to my own discomfort. I tried to lose myself in the archives, to let the fragile maps and faded letters shield me from the inevitable. But the thought of the event was a low, persistent hum in the back of my mind. It was not until Friday evening, the night before the dedication, that the hum became a roar. My mother called again. This time, there was no pretense of a friendly check-in. Her voice was clipped, all business. "Aris, I was just reviewing the seating chart with the event planner, and it reminded me. I need you to be very clear on this. That thing on your arm, it needs to be covered." I stopped what I was doing, a canister of archival film in my hand. I knew exactly what she meant. That thing. She refused to even call it a tattoo. It was a blemish, an imperfection, a problem to be managed. "Mom, it is on my forearm," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "It is not something I can just hide under a watch band." "Then find a dress with long sleeves," she retorted, her impatience evident. "A simple black gown with elegant full-length sleeves. It is not a difficult request. Your father and I have invested millions into this project. We will not have our family's reputation tarnished by adolescent rebellion." Adolescent rebellion. I was 38 years old. The ink on my arm was not a drunken mistake from college. It was a deliberate, solemn act I had undertaken 5 years ago, after a flag had been folded and handed to me after the world had gone silent. But they did not know that. They never asked. To them, the story began and ended with what their friends at the country club might think. My father's voice came onto the line, then deeper and more cutting. "It is not just about the tattoo, Aris. It is about the life it represents. A life spent in a basement, away from the world. We gave you every advantage, a top-tier education, a name that opens doors. And you chose this. You chose to be forgettable." He said the word forgettable, as if it were the worst insult he could imagine. And in his world, maybe it was. The line went quiet for a moment. I could hear their synchronized breathing on the other end, waiting for my compliance. The weight in my chest returned heavier this time. Every word they spoke was a small chip at the armor I had built around myself. They were not just criticizing a piece of art on my skin. They were criticizing my choices, my grief, my entire existence. They were judging the very mission that gave my life meaning, all without ever knowing it existed. Fine, I said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I will find something with sleeves. Good, my mother said, the relief in her voice making it all worse. We will see you tomorrow at 7 sharp. Do not be late. I hung up the phone and did not move for a long time. The silence of the archive felt different. It was not peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, suffocating. I looked down at my arm, at the intricate lines of the code. It was a memorial, a promise, a secret I carried every single day. And tomorrow night, I would have to hide it, tucking away the most meaningful part of my life under layers of fabric, just to appease 2 people who would never, ever understand. The moment I stepped through the grand archway of the Harrison wing, the quiet of my basement world shattered. The air itself felt expensive, thick, with the scent of overpriced perfume and the low hum of self-congratulation. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter, loud and confident, echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. This was my parents' natural habitat, a jungle of wealth and influence where they were the apex predators. For me, it was a foreign land where I did not speak the language. I had found a dress as promised. It was a simple, elegant black gown, but the fabric of the long-sleeved dress felt tight across my shoulders, a constant, itchy reminder of the part of myself I was forced to conceal. I felt like an actress in a play I had not rehearsed for wearing a costume that did not fit. I spotted my parents near the center of the room. They were not my parents tonight. They were the Harrisons' patrons of the arts and captains of industry, playing their roles to perfection. My mother, draped in a gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, glided through the crowd, accepting compliments with a practiced, modest smile. My father stood like a titan in the center of a small galaxy of admirers, a glass of something dark and expensive in his hand, his voice a confident boom as he spoke of market projections and political leverage. He saw me approach, and his smile tightened for a fraction of a second. He gave me a quick, dismissive nod before turning back to his conversation. My mother broke away from her group and drifted over her eyes, performing a swift, critical scan from my shoes to my hair. "You came," she said, as if my presence was a pleasant surprise rather than a mandate. "The dress is adequate. Try to mingle, darling. Do not just stand in a corner. It looks morose." But a corner was all I wanted. The conversations swirling around me were about things I had no connection to. I heard snippets as people passed. A tech merger going through for $300 million. A new yacht being christened in Monaco. A senator's chief of staff who owed someone a favor. It was a world built on transactions, on what could be gained and who could be leveraged. My world was built on what had been lost and on the duty to remember. I felt like a ghost haunting someone else's victory party. Every smile felt false, every handshake a calculation. I could feel the weight of their judgment, the polite but curious glances that sized me up and found me wanting. I was not one of them, the daughter of the great Harrison Thorne, and yet a complete anomaly. So I did exactly what my mother told me not to do. I found a small alcove behind a marble pillar partially obscured from the main flow of the crowd. From here, I could see them, but they could not easily see me. Here, at least, I could breathe. I could become what my father accused me of being. Forgettable. It was the only defense I had. My fragile peace behind the marble pillar lasted less than 10 minutes. I saw my father making his way through the crowd, not towards me, but towards a small group of what were clearly his most important guests. There was a man with a shock of white hair who looked like a senator and a younger, impeccably dressed man who was nodding deferentially at everything my father said. As they neared my alcove, my father's voice grew louder, more performative. He was holding court. He gestured expansively at the grand hall around them. We wanted to create a space, he declared, that honors the past but is firmly focused on the future. A legacy of scholarship. The white-haired man clapped him on the shoulder. "You have done it, Harrison. A magnificent tribute. And to have your own family so deeply involved in academia, it is a wonderful thing." He then looked around as if searching for someone. "And where is your brilliant daughter, the one with the doctorate?" My stomach tightened into a cold knot. I tried to shrink further into the shadows, but it was too late. My father's eyes found me. A flicker of something, perhaps annoyance, crossed his face before he plastered on a wide, magnanimous smile. "Ah, there she is," he said, his voice booming across the space. He gestured for me to come out. "Aris, come and say hello to Senator Davies." Reluctantly, I stepped out from behind the pillar. The senator gave me a warm, professional smile. My father, however, did not let me speak. He placed a heavy, proprietary hand on my shoulder and turned to the group. He was not introducing me. He was presenting me as an exhibit, an odd little curiosity tied to his legacy. And then he delivered the final cut, the one that would echo in my mind for years to come. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound that was meant to be charming. He said, "Yes, my Aris. She is a brilliant girl. I build this entire wing for the study of history, a place for real scholars to make their mark." He paused for dramatic effect, looking directly at me. "And she just likes to play with the dusty old papers down in the basement." The men in the group chuckled politely. It was a joke, a harmless little jab from a proud father. But to me, it was a public execution. He had not just belittled my work, he had nullified it. He had taken my passion, my mission, my entire life's purpose, and reduced it to a child's hobby in front of the very people he deemed important. He had made me small, insignificant, a punchline in his grand story. I felt the blood drain from my face. I could feel their eyes on me, filled with a sort of polite pity. The daughter who could not quite live up to the family name. In that moment, I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. I wanted to disappear, but I could not. I could only stand there under the weight of his hand and the crushing burden of his words and let the silence scream. For a long moment, the world seemed to slow down. The polite laughter of the senator and his friends faded into a dull, distant roar. The clinking of glasses, the soft music from the string quartet, it all dissolved into a meaningless buzz. The only thing that felt real was the heavy pressure of my father's hand on my shoulder and the sharp metallic taste of humiliation in my mouth. My first instinct was to flee, to turn and walk out of that grand hall, away from the pitying eyes and the suffocating weight of their judgment. I could feel the tears welling up hot and sharp, threatening to spill over and complete the picture of the overly sensitive, disappointing daughter. But then something else took over. A different voice, a calmer, stronger one from deep inside. It was not a voice of anger, but of clarity. I did not cry. I did not run. Instead, I did the one thing they did not expect. I did nothing. I simply stood there, my posture straightening almost imperceptibly. I lifted my chin just a fraction of an inch. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the air fill my lungs, steadying the tremor I felt in my hands. I did not look at my father. I did not look at the senator. My gaze drifted past them towards the soaring windows that looked out into the night. In that small act of stillness, everything shifted. I was not just Aris Thorne, the daughter. I was Dr. Aris Thorne, the keeper of secrets. And this moment was not about my hurt feelings. It was about something infinitely larger. A memory flashed through my mind, vivid and sharp. It was of another man, a man in uniform, standing on a dusty tarmac. David, he was about to leave on his final deployment. He had gently taken my arm, his thumb tracing the spot where the tattoo now rested. He said, "Whatever happens, Aris finished the work. The mission is all that matters." His voice cut through the noise of the gala. The mission is all that matters. This was not my battle. My battle was fought in the silence of the archives against the erosion of time and the forgetting of history. My father's words were just noise. They could not touch the core of who I was or what I was doing. They could not tarnish the promise I had made. My silence was not weakness, it was armor. And as I stood there, rooted to the spot, I was not just protecting my own dignity, I was protecting his. Just as my father was about to launch into another anecdote, likely about his own undergraduate days, a subtle shift rippled through the grand hall. The ambient chatter seemed to dip in volume. People near the main entrance turned their heads, their conversations momentarily forgotten. A quiet wave of deference and curiosity washed over the crowd. My father paused, sensing the change in the room's atmosphere. He followed the collective gaze towards the archway. The event coordinator, a woman who had been a whirlwind of frantic energy all evening, was now standing at attention, her expression a mixture of reverence and anxiety. She was speaking to a man who had just arrived. He was not tall or physically imposing in the way a movie star might be, but he carried an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. He was older, perhaps, in his late 50s, with a lean, weathered face and short, graying hair. He wore a decorated naval dress uniform, the dark blue fabric crisp and immaculate. The gold on his shoulders seemed to absorb the light of the chandeliers, and the array of ribbons on his chest told a story of a life lived in places most people only read about. He moved with a profound economy of motion. There was no wasted energy, no grand gestures. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, swept across the room with a calm, assessing gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. He was a predator in a room full of peacocks, a wolf who had wandered into a garden party, and everyone instinctively knew it. My father's breath hitched. I know that man. He whispered more to himself than to anyone else. That is Commander Marcus Rhys. The name meant nothing to me, but it clearly meant something to the other guests. A low murmur went through the room. Commander Rhys, the hero of the Zabul Valley engagement, the man who had held the line against impossible odds. He was not just a soldier. He was a living legend, the guest of honor. My mother, who had been holding court across the room, immediately began making her way towards the entrance. Her social radar locked onto the most important person in the building. My father, momentarily forgetting his own story, excused himself from the senator with a hasty apology and started to move in the same direction, his face set with a look of determined ambition. This was the ultimate prize for them. To be seen with Commander Rhys, to have him acknowledge their contribution, would be the crowning achievement of their evening. It would solidify their status in a way that no financial donation ever could. I stayed where I was, a silent observer in the shadows. I watched as this man, this icon of military valor, navigated the sea of outstretched hands and sycophantic smiles. He was polite, but distant, shaking a hand here, offering a brief reserved nod there. His eyes, however, never stopped moving. They were not looking for donors or senators. They were searching for something else entirely, and I had the strangest, most unsettling feeling that he was looking for me. The room seemed to hold its breath as Commander Rhys moved. It was like watching a shark navigate a tank of goldfish. Everyone parted before him, a silent, instinctual show of respect. My father, who had managed to position himself strategically in Rhys's path, prepared a broad, welcoming smile, his hand slightly outstretched, ready for the handshake that would validate his entire evening. My mother was a few steps behind her expression, a perfect blend of admiration and social grace. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The convergence of their world of influence in the world of genuine heroism embodied by the commander. But the moment never came. Commander Rhys's eyes, those piercing blue instruments of assessment, swept right past my father, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. He ignored the outstretched hand. He gave my mother a barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement, the kind one gives to a stranger in a crowded elevator before continuing on his path. He did not stop. He did not slow down. He walked with a quiet, unyielding purpose, cutting a direct line through the glittering crowd. And that line, I realized with a sudden heart-pounding certainty, ended directly at the marble pillar where I stood. The air in my lungs turned to ice. This could not be happening. It was a mistake. He must be looking for someone behind me, someone more important. But there was no one. There was only me, the quiet archivist in the ill-fitting dress, the ghost at my family's feast. My father's smile faltered, then collapsed entirely. His hand dropped to his side. I saw his face twist in a brief, ugly flash of confusion and wounded pride. My mother's perfectly composed expression froze a mask of disbelief cracking at the edges. The senator and the other important guests who had been orbiting my father now stood in awkward silence, watching the scene unfold. The 10 yards separating Commander Rhys from me felt like a mile. With every step he took, the ambient noise of the party seemed to fade further until the only sound I could hear was the frantic drumming of my own heart against my ribs. He was not just approaching, he was creating a new center of gravity in the room, and he was pulling me into it. He finally stopped, less than 2 feet in front of me. Up close, the lines on his face were deeper, telling stories of sun and stress, and things I could only imagine. His eyes were not cold, as I had expected, but held a profound, almost weary intelligence. He looked at me, really looked at me in a way no one else in that room had. He saw past the dress, past the social awkwardness, past the daughter of Harrison Thorne. He saw me, and in that moment, I knew my life as a ghost was over. The silence that stretched between us was absolute. It felt louder than all the polite chatter that had filled the room just moments before. Every eye in the grand hall was now fixed on our small, isolated stage of marble floor. I could feel my father's stare, hot and incredulous, boring into the back of my head. I could sense my mother's frozen horror. They were no longer the center of attention. They were now merely spectators to a drama they could not comprehend. Commander Rhys did not offer a handshake. He did not introduce himself. He simply looked at me for another long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried with the clear, calm authority of a man used to being obeyed without question. It cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Dr. Thorne," he said. The name spoken with such formality and respect felt alien in this room where I was only ever Aris or my daughter. I managed a small, almost imperceptible nod, my throat too tight to form words. He continued, his gaze unwavering. "I have been looking for you for some time. I need to thank you." My father, recovering from his initial shock, took a hesitant step forward. He forced a laugh, a brittle, nervous sound that shattered the tense quiet. "Commander, you must have me at a disadvantage. My daughter, she is just an academic. I think there might be a misunderstanding." Commander Rhys did not even turn to look at him. His focus remained entirely on me. He said, "There is no misunderstanding, sir." Then he addressed me again, and his next words were not for me alone. They were for my father, for my mother, for the senator, and all the important people who had witnessed my humiliation. He was making a public record. He said, "Dr. Thorne, your translations of the 18th century Pashtun maps were not just academic. They were the single most critical piece of intelligence we had during Operation Vigilant Saber. You gave us the routes the insurgency was using, routes that were invisible on any modern satellite imagery. You gave us a way out when we were surrounded." The room, which had been quiet before, was now utterly still. The air crackled with stunned disbelief. I saw my father's jaw go slack. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Rhys was not finished. He took a small step closer, his voice dropping slightly but losing none of its intensity. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the powerful men standing near my father. "The work this woman does, the work you dismissed as playing with dusty old papers, is the reason my entire team is alive today. She did not just contribute to the mission. She saved it, and she saved us." The commander's words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. Saved them. The words echoed in the cavernous silence, dismantling my father's carefully constructed world brick by brick. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. It was as if a bomb had gone off, not of noise and fire, but of pure, unadulterated truth. I watched my father's face. The confident, condescending mask he wore so effortlessly had shattered. What was left was something naked and ugly. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The easy charm, the casual authority, it all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a man utterly stripped of his power. He tried to speak to form a response, but only a choked, sputtering sound came out. My daughter, she just... He could not finish the sentence. How could he? The punchline to his favorite joke had just been revealed as a hero. The family anecdote he used to get a polite laugh from senators had been exposed as a profound, shameful ignorance. Commander Rhys finally turned his head just slightly and leveled a look at my father. It was not a look of anger or contempt. It was something far worse. It was a look of complete and utter dismissal. A look that said, "You are not important enough for my anger." Then Rhys directed his next words to my father. But they were meant for everyone. "Sir," he said, his voice as cold and hard as iron, "the value of a person is not measured by the buildings they fund or the galas they host. It is measured by their actions. And the actions of your daughter, the quiet work she does in what you call a basement, have had more impact on national security than every dollar you have ever donated. Her work," he repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing, "has more value than this entire wing." The collective gasp from the surrounding guests was audible. It was a devastating public rebuke. My father flinched as if he had been physically struck. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty grayish pallor. He looked old, small. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as a titan, but as a hollow man, his entire sense of self-worth built on a foundation of money and influence that had just crumbled to dust beneath his feet. My mother was no better. She stood frozen a few feet away, her hand still clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that was part disbelief and part social catastrophe. Their perfect evening, their moment of triumph, had turned into their worst nightmare. They were witnessing their own public irrelevance, delivered by the one man whose approval they craved above all others. The public humiliation was complete. My parents stood like statues, broken and silent. The crowd around them began to murmur the shock, giving way to a new intense wave of speculation. But Commander Rhys was not finished. The first part of his reckoning had been for them. This next part, I realized, was for me. He turned his full attention back to me, and the hard, commanding edge in his voice softened. His gaze dropped from my eyes, down to my right arm, still covered by the long, elegant sleeve of the dress my mother had insisted upon. "I imagine that sleeve is not very comfortable," he said, his voice now quiet, intimate, a private conversation happening in a room full of people. I did not know what to say, so I just shook my head slightly. He nodded, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even sadness, in his eyes. Then he looked at me again. "I was told I might find it here," he said cryptically. "The final piece of the puzzle." My heart began to beat a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. I knew what he was asking for. He was asking to see it, the secret I had guarded for 5 long years. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, I reached across and took the cuff of my right sleeve. I hesitated for just a second, a lifetime of keeping this part of myself hidden, warring with the unspoken command in his eyes. Then I slowly, deliberately pulled the fabric up, pushing it back past my wrist, over my forearm, until the tattoo was fully exposed under the bright, unforgiving light of the chandeliers. The intricate wheel of script and coordinates seemed to pulse on my skin. Commander Rhys did not speak. He simply stared at it. His professional composure, the iron mask of a career soldier, seemed to crack just a little. His breath caught in his throat, a small, sharp sound that was achingly human. "I did not think I would ever see that again," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I could not quite name. It was more than surprise. It was reverence. It was grief. He looked up from my arm, his eyes locking with mine. Z18, he said, his voice barely audible. October 11th, the date and the call sign. It is not just the map's coordinates, is it? It is the last transmission from Lieutenant David Thorne, your husband. The name spoken aloud in this place felt like a physical blow. The last most protected wall around my heart crumbled. The secret was out, and the look on my parents' faces told me they had just realized their terrible, terrible mistake. If Commander Rhys's previous words had been a bomb, these last words were the chilling fallout that poisoned everything it touched. The name David Thorne hung in the air thick with the weight of 5 years of unspoken grief. And in that moment, the entire narrative of the evening of my life was rewritten in the horrified eyes of my parents. I turned my head and looked at them, really looked at them. And I saw something I had never seen before. Not disappointment, not annoyance, but pure, undiluted shock, followed by a wave of sickening comprehension. My father, the man of influence and unshakable confidence, visibly recoiled. He stumbled back a step, his hand coming up to grip the back of a chair as if he needed it for support. His face, which had been pale with humiliation, now turned ashen with a dawning horror. The tattoo was not a rebellious act. The quiet daughter was not a failure. The dusty papers were not a hobby. It was all connected. Connected to the quiet, polite young man in uniform he had once shaken hands with at a wedding. The son-in-law he had never truly tried to know, the one whose death he had treated with a distant, almost clinical sympathy before quickly moving on. He was not just wrong about me. He had been profoundly, unforgivably wrong about David. But it was my mother's reaction that struck me the most. Her hand, which had been pressed to her mouth in social horror, now clenched at her chest as if she could not breathe. A low, wounded sound escaped her lips, a sound of genuine soul-deep pain. Her eyes locked on the tattoo and then on my face, and in them I saw the last 5 years of my life flash by. Every time she had called it that thing, every time she had sighed with disappointment, every condescending piece of advice, every cutting remark was now reframed, not as a mother's misguided concern, but as an unwitting desecration of her own daughter's mourning. She remembered. I could see it in her eyes. She remembered telling me to get over it and move on. She remembered her frustration when I chose the archives over a more lucrative career. She had not been pushing me to be better. She had been punishing me for my grief. The truth had not set them free. It had imprisoned them in a cage of their own making, built from years of casual cruelty and willful ignorance. They had not just failed to see my worth. They had trampled on the memory of a man who had given his life for his country, a man who had been a part of their family. And the public stage they had so desperately craved was now the theater for their most profound and personal shame. Commander Rhys seemed to understand that the world had just tilted on its axis for my parents. He gave them a moment of crushing silence before he continued, his voice now softer, directed at me, but loud enough for them to hear every single word. Every syllable was a judgment. He said, "For 5 years, the official report on Operation Vigilant Saber has had a black box over the final hour. No one knew how Lieutenant Thorne identified the ambush location. We only knew that his final transmission saved 17 men from walking into a trap." He paused, his eyes finding the tattoo on my arm once more. The ink was a testament, a piece of evidence in the center of the glittering room. "Now I understand," he continued. "He did not have our intel. He had something better. He had you. He must have found that 18th century map, the one no one else knew existed, and realized its significance. He did not have time to transmit images or long descriptions. So he sent the one thing he knew you would understand, a call sign, a date, and a set of coordinates encrypted in a language only you two shared." His eyes then lifted to meet mine, and the look in them was one of profound respect, the kind soldiers reserve for other soldiers. He was not just sending intelligence, Dr. Thorne. He was placing his final act of service, his very legacy, into your hands. He trusted you to finish his mission, and you did. You took his last words, his last breath, and you used them to save his brothers. The story was complete. The final piece had clicked into place. My work in the archives was not just an act of remembrance. It was the fulfillment of a sacred trust. It was the last order my husband had ever given me. I looked over at my father. He was staring at me now, not with disappointment, but with a look of stunned, almost fearful reverence. He was not looking at his daughter anymore. He was looking at a stranger, a woman who had been part of a secret world of heroes and sacrifice, right under his nose, a world he had dismissed as irrelevant. My mother finally lowered her hand from her chest, her face streaked with tears she was not even trying to hide. The shame, the regret, the catastrophic weight of what she had done was all there. They had not just misunderstood my job. They had misunderstood the deepest, most defining tragedy of my life. And they had done it loudly, publicly, and repeatedly for 5 long years. The revelation settled over the room, not with a bang, but with a profound, weighty silence. The gossip, the speculation, it all died, replaced by something else. Awe. The guests, the senators, the donors, they were no longer looking at a family drama. They were witnessing a story of valor and sacrifice that eclipsed every conversation about money and politics that had filled the hall that evening. And in that moment, I felt a shift inside me. The shame I had carried, the feeling of being an outsider, it all just dissolved. I was no longer the quiet, disappointing daughter. I was the keeper of a legacy, the final link in a chain of heroism. I finally found my voice. It did not tremble, it was not loud, but it was clear, and it was steady, and it was mine. He never abandoned a mission, I said, looking not at my parents, but at Commander Rhys. It was the first thing I had said since this whole exchange began, and the words felt incredibly powerful. They were a testament to David, a defense of my work, and a quiet declaration of my own identity, all in one. Commander Rhys nodded slowly, his eyes holding mine. "No, ma'am," he said, the honorific, now sounding completely natural. He did not. And then the balance of power in my family, a dynamic that had been set in stone for 38 years, crumbled into dust. It was not a conscious decision, but I simply turned my back on my parents. I did not offer them a look of anger or forgiveness. I offered them nothing. Their opinions, their approval, their disappointment had ceased to be relevant. They no longer had any power over me. I looked at the stunned faces of the guests, the people whose judgment I had feared all evening. I saw no pity in their eyes now, only a deep, unvarnished respect. They were not looking at Harrison Thorne's daughter. They were looking at Dr. Aris Thorne. Some of them, including the senator my father had been so desperate to impress, gave me a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement from their world, a world I had never sought to enter, but had now inadvertently conquered. My father made a small, choked sound behind me, as if he was about to speak my name, but he did not. What could he possibly say? What apology could ever be enough to bridge the vast, silent chasm that had just opened up between us? He had built this entire wing as a monument to his own legacy. But in the space of 5 minutes, my quiet, hidden life had completely overshadowed it. He wanted to be remembered. But tonight, everyone in this room would go home remembering the story of his forgotten daughter. I did not wait for the formal end of the ceremony. I did not need to. My part in the evening's drama was over. With a final brief nod to Commander Rhys, a silent acknowledgement that passed between two people who understood the true meaning of duty, I turned and walked away. I moved through the parted crowd, the whispers and respectful glances following me like a wake. I did not look back at my parents. I did not need to see the wreckage. I found my way to a small, secluded terrace that overlooked the university grounds. The cool night air was a welcome relief, washing over my face and clearing the last vestiges of the stuffy, emotionally charged atmosphere of the gala. The distant sounds of the party faded, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the quiet hum of the campus at night. I was alone for only a few minutes before I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I did not have to turn to know who it was. "It is a clear night," Commander Rhys said, his voice calm as he came to stand beside me at the stone balustrade. I nodded my eyes, fixed on the distant lights of the library. "Yes, it is." We stood in a comfortable silence for a moment. It was not the awkward, tense silence of the party, but the easy silence of two people who did not need words to understand each other. "He was a good man," Rhys said, finally, his gaze also turned towards the horizon. "One of the best, brave, and smarter than anyone ever gave him credit for." "He knew you would figure it out," I said, my voice quiet. "He always said I was the only one who could keep up with him." Rhys allowed himself a small-eyed smile. He was right about that. He reached into the inner pocket of his dress uniform jacket. He pulled out something small and heavy, the metal cool in the night air. He pressed it into my hand. I looked down. It was a challenge coin, thick bronze, with the intricate insignia of his SEAL team embossed on one side. On the other, the words, "The only easy day was yesterday." It was not a souvenir, it was a symbol, a sacred object in their world given only as a sign of ultimate respect and acceptance. It was something my father's millions could never, ever buy. "We do not give these to civilians, Dr. Thorne," he said softly. "But you were never a civilian in this fight. You were part of the team. You brought our brother home." I closed my hand around the coin, the weight of it a solid grounding presence in my palm. Tears I had refused to shed in front of my family now welled in my eyes, but they were not tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of gratitude, of release. After 5 long years of carrying this burden alone, someone finally understood. The weeks that followed the gala were quieter, but in a way that felt fundamentally different. The silence in my archives was no longer a refuge from the world. It was a respected institution. The story of what had happened that night rippled through the university and beyond, taking on a life of its own. It became a quiet legend on campus, a tale whispered among students and faculty about the unassuming archivist in the basement who had saved a team of Navy SEALs. I did not seek out the attention, but it found me anyway. A few days after the event, I received a formal letter from the dean's office. It was not a reprimand or a query. It was an invitation. The university, in conjunction with a direct request from the Department of Naval Intelligence, wanted to establish a new graduate fellowship, the Lieutenant David Thorne Memorial Fellowship for Strategic Historical Analysis, and they wanted me to lead it. They were giving me a budget, a staff, a mandate to expand my work to find other forgotten pieces of history that held modern tactical value. My dusty papers were now considered a vital strategic asset. The legacy I had tried to protect in private was now being enshrined as a public institution. The first tangible change was the visitors. Before, my only guests were occasional doctoral candidates or university maintenance staff. Now I had a steady stream of them. Young, sharp-eyed intelligence analysts from Quantico, seasoned strategists from the Pentagon, and most meaningfully groups of young officers in training sent here as part of their curriculum. I remember the first group that came down. 10 young men and women, all with the focused, serious expressions of people who understood the weight of their future responsibilities. They did not see a dusty basement or a quiet academic. They saw a living piece of their own history, a direct link between the past they studied and the future they would command. I stood before them, not in a gown with long sleeves, but in my simple lab coat, the tattoo on my forearm clearly visible. I unrolled a series of charts on the main research table, the very maps that had started it all. "History is not dead," I told them, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet hall. It is not just a collection of stories. It is a live database of tactics, of mistakes, and of victories. Your enemy's great-grandfather made the same mistakes your enemy will make. Your job is to find them first. They listened with an intensity I had never seen before. They took notes. They asked sharp, insightful questions. In their eyes, I saw no judgment, only a profound, energizing respect. I was not just teaching them history, I was arming them with it. And in doing so, I was creating a new kind of legacy, one that David and I were now building together. My quiet, solitary mission had become a symphony late one afternoon, long after the last of my students had left for the day. I found myself alone in the archives once more. The silence had returned, but it was a comfortable, familiar friend. The setting sun cast long, golden rays through the high basement windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny, glittering stars in my own private galaxy. The air was filled with the scent of old paper and the promise of new discoveries. It was the smell of my life's work, and for the first time, it smelled like victory. I sat at my main desk, the heavy bronze challenge coin that Commander Rhys had given me resting on the blotter beside a stack of 19th century naval logs. It had become a permanent fixture in my workspace, a solid, tangible reminder of the night everything changed. It was a testament that my quiet, solitary work had mattered. My eyes drifted to my forearm, resting on the desk. The tattoo, the intricate wheel of script and coordinates, was no longer a secret I had to hide. It was a badge of honor, a story written on my skin. It was not a brand of my grief, but a symbol of my purpose. It represented a love that had been strong enough to transcend death and a promise that I had kept against all odds. It was a memorial, a map, and a mission statement, all in one. I no longer felt like a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. I was fully present, fully seen, not because of my family's name or their money, but because of the work I had done and the legacy I had chosen to uphold. I had found my place not in the glittering world upstairs, but down here among the quiet, powerful truths of the past. My parents and I, we speak sometimes. The calls are infrequent, hesitant. The old dynamics of disappointment and control are gone, replaced by a vast, awkward space they don't know how to navigate. They are trying in their own way to understand the world I live in. Maybe one day they will, but I have realized that my own peace no longer depends on their understanding. My worth is not a reflection in their eyes. It is something I built myself down here in the quiet dark, forged from love loss and an unbreakable sense of duty. I picked up the challenge coin, its weight familiar in my palm. I thought of David, of Commander Rhys, and of the young officers who now looked to me for guidance. The mission was not over. It would never be over. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace with that. I smiled a real, genuine smile and got back to work. Aris's story is a powerful reminder that the most important work is often done in silence, unseen and uncelebrated. Her value was not defined by those who refused to see it, but by the lives she touched and the duty she fulfilled. It teaches us that true strength is not about demanding respect, but about earning it through integrity and quiet dedication. What do you think was the most powerful moment in Aris's journey to reclaim her own story? Was it the public confrontation or the quiet moment of recognition on the terrace? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories of quiet heroes and vindication inspire you, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. Your support helps us continue to bring these important narratives to light.